What's going on, guys? My name is Taylor Oglesville and welcome back to another TaylorMade Creations video. In today's video I'm going to show you how to build these end tables. They're pretty much an exact copy of the coffee table I built, which I'll leave a link to that video in the description below. But I just love the way they turned out. They look awesome, and I think painting the frame black just looks so good. Makes it look like steel. Wish I could weld. I just don't have any welding equipment, but no better way than to make a copy of steel by just painting it black. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the build.
I went with my usual wood for this project, which is pine wood. So I picked up 3 2x6s from Home Depot and began ripping 3 2x2s out of each 2x6 in order to start cutting the pieces for the legs. Next, I ripped both sides of the 4 2x10s I picked up. I made sure to rip them down to make them 8 inches wide. Next, I went over to the miter saw and I set up my usual stop block and cut all of the ripped 2x10s down to their correct size. Next, I began laying all of the pieces out for the 4 shelves, and I made sure to alternate grain up versus grain down to prevent any bowing in the future. After I laid out all the shelves, I was able to mark where I was going to put all my pocket holes to put these together. Next, I took out my Kreg jig and drilled all the pocket holes on the underside of the shelves. I definitely recommend getting this Kreg jig. I'll put a link in the description below. Now that I drilled all the pocket holes, I could now start putting the shelves together. So I took out my Kreg clamp to make sure the boards were flush, took out my trigger clamp to make sure the boards stayed together tightly, screwed in the screw, and then repeated that process for each screw. Next, I got on my miter saw again and cut all the 2x2s down to the correct length for the legs. Next, I took out my Kreg jig again and started drilling all the pocket holes in the leg pieces. Now it was time for assembly, so I cut 2 1-inch spacers, set the piece on it, and then used my trigger clamp to tighten them together, and then I screwed in the screw, and repeated that process as I put the entire frame together. Next, I took out my jigsaw and notched each corner of the bottom shelves in order for the bottom shelf to fit perfectly within the frame. Next, I did a dry assembly of the entire piece, and then I took out my router, put a 1/8 roundover bit in, and went along all the edges of the pieces in order to get it ready for me to paint and stain. When working with wood, especially pine wood, the wood will begin to dry out over time and bow or shrink, and so the table would become wobbly, and so I wanted to put leg levers in. So I used a 3/4 inch Forstner bit to give me a little bit of an indentation, and then a 5/16 bit to drill about 1.5 inch deep hole, and then I put in my T-nut and then screwed in my leg leveler. Before I took these pieces apart to paint and stain them, I went ahead and sanded them to 80 grit and then finished off with 220 grit to make them nice and smooth. Next, I took out my usual favorite stain, which is the Minwax Dark Walnut, and stained all 4 shelves. Now that the shelves were stained, I could go ahead and spray paint the frames. And I decided to spray paint these frames instead of stain them like I did my coffee table in my earlier video, because it just gave me a lot more solid black and just looked a lot more even. Also, it helps when you're spray painting things to be able to set them on the painter's pyramid. Gets it up off the ground and makes it easier to paint. So I'll leave a link to the painter's pyramid in the description below. Next, I sprayed a polyacrylic finish over the frames just to protect the spray paint from getting chips or any scratches. After all the pieces had dried for a couple hours, I was able to finally assemble it all. So I put the top and bottom shelves on and used 2.5-inch screws to screw them from the underside of the frame. The last few steps to finish up this project was just to apply the Minwax polyacrylic finish to the shelves, and then apply my stamp brand to the bottom of the shelf. Looking good.
I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a really fun and simple build, and I'll probably be building these again in the near future. But if you aren't already subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you have any questions, just leave me a comment below. And if you like any of the tools I use or materials, I'll leave a link in the description below. But other than that, until next time.